single day, like I've always done and always will.
Yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantel Destra. This week, Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado officially launched his campaign for governor, setting the stage to challenge his current boss, Governor Kathy Hochul, in the Democratic primary. The move comes just a few months after a public split between the two. Back in February, Delgado announced that he would not be running on Hochul's ticket in 2026. Now, with just about a year until the Democratic primary, Delgado is looking to get support from voters. In a campaign announcement video, the lieutenant governor said that New Yorkers needed, quote, a bold, decisive, and transformational leader. To discuss the news of Delgado challenging Hochul and the political implications, we are joined by Rebecca Lewis of City and State New York. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Now, can you help us understand how did we get here in which we're seeing the lieutenant governor challenging the governor to lead the state?
That's a long story, but it's an interesting one. I mean, it starts all the way back. I think someone on Twitter had actually had a timeline that it goes all the way back to Spitzer, and his fall from grace got us to where we are now. The relationship between the Governor Hochul, and her lieutenant governor, her hand-picked lieutenant governor, has been pretty rocky for most of their tenure. It's whether that's because ultimately they didn't get along, or he bristled under her leadership. You know, that's for closed room discussions, but it became very clear, especially at the end of last year, that they were no longer seeing eye to eye. I think the one of the first big public breaks was when Antonio Delgado decided to say that Joe Biden should drop out as the Democratic nominee, even as Governor Hochul remained one of his staunchest supporters. And from there, it just continued to drift apart. I think none of us were surprised when he announced that he was running for governor. We were all expecting it, but this isn't entirely unusual. It's not the first time that governors and lieutenant governors have disagreed, and it's not even the first time when a lieutenant governor has decided to run for governor themselves, but it's always interesting to see.
And given the fact that it wasn't a surprise, as you mentioned, what did you think of the rollout of the campaign and the messaging?
The rollout was a little odd. It came out, it seemed clear that they wanted to launch it with an exclusive in the New York Times and then a follow-up interview with New York One in New York City. But the New York Post came out with a anonymously sourced story first. And this was early evening on a Monday, seemed like an odd time to launch. It was the day before, or 2 days before, the first New York City mayoral, Democratic primary mayoral debate. And that's also been getting most of the attention, certainly downstate, but it's New York City. So that race has been getting a lot of attention regardless, especially as President Donald Trump is in some ways getting involved too. So the timing has been a little unusual, but it gives him lots of runway to get his message out, to get his name out there, because he has a long way to go to get his name recognition up. And it's very clear that he is charting a left-wing path. He is going to be challenging the governor from the left. He's going to be pushing for some progressive policies and trying to hit her where she's vulnerable with those more left-wing communities.
And the most interesting part about this for me was the slew of elected officials and lawmakers who came out once the campaign was announced, and they said that they were supporting the governor. What did you make of these political moves?
You know, it's not entirely surprising to see that the leader of the state party, the incumbent governor, first female governor, is getting support, but it's not every day that you necessarily see an announcement from a challenger and then all of the endorsements are for the incumbent or the person that they're running against. It's certainly a show of support for the governor. It makes it clear that the institutional Democrats are going to be behind her, that she will have support from elected officials, even in Albany, where she's not always necessarily everyone's favorite person in the legislature, that she is going to have a lot of the support. And Delgado, his campaign has said they're not trying to get those endorsements anyway. They want to run with a grassroots campaign. Now, whether that's, them trying to make light of all these endorsements coming out for the governor and singing her praises, or if they genuinely recognize that this was going to be the situation, it's clear that he will have to rely on some of the more grassroots organizing if he wants to challenge Hochul and her prodigious fundraising and institutional support.
And how do you think this campaign from the lieutenant governor sort of impacts other candidates who are vying for the Democratic nominee?
Well, there's really one main potential candidate at this point who has not yet announced, and that's Congressman Richie Torres. But the further along we go, the less likely it seems like he might decide to actually jump in. And it's very possible that with Delgado making it official, perhaps others decide they don't want to bother, don't want to try. And certainly if he takes up the left-wing position and if he starts to get the backing from prominent left-wing groups, there is probably less likely to be another challenger from the left. Of course, it's not impossible, but if he starts consolidating that support, it might discourage other potential progressives from jumping in. And whether or not that impacts what Torres ultimately decides to do, it's hard to say. He's definitely going to run more aligned with the governor, less so a progressive challenge.
And lastly, in the time that we have left, how do you think this impacts the governor as she leads the state and also gears up for re-election?
It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see the governor and her lieutenant going head to head in a campaign like this. But she's already basically stripped Delgado of what limited official authority he had as her number two. He hasn't really been acting in an official capacity representing her in quite some time. Now, that's not to say he hasn't been around the state. He hasn't been using his title as lieutenant governor, that he's not still lieutenant governor. But it might make things a little bit even more tense. He said at his rally in Brooklyn the other day that he hasn't spoken to the governor in quite some time. And it might bring out, a competitive side in the governor, and we might start seeing a little bit more jabbing, whether directly or indirectly from her campaign. So we might start to see her begin shifting into that campaign mode even more than she already has been with some of her messaging.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. Love coming on.
And we were speaking with Rebecca Lewis of City and State New York. In this next segment, we'll sit down with State Senator Liz Krueger. We spoke with the Senate Finance Committee chair about the process of debating the state budget in the upper chamber, as well as the possibility of the legislature making a return to the Capitol to address federal cuts later this year. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Senator.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Now, as chair of the Senate Finance Committee, you are at the forefront during budget debates in the chamber. So what are some of your biggest takeaways from the process this year?
Well, the process was a little complicated. We were 40 days late. And to be honest, I'm still not totally sure why we were 40 days late. The governor had a number of priority policy issues that we needed to hash out. And I get it, but they weren't even budget specific. So we could have gotten the budget done on time, still hashed out the policy issues. Meanwhile, we wouldn't have been behind on budget and we would have been moving forward with a bunch of other legislative priorities that now we're in panic about getting done because we only have like 2 weeks left, counting this week, and an enormous list of important legislation to so many people.
And how does this year's budget stack up to other years in terms of delivering for New Yorkers?
To be honest, it was a pretty good budget for New Yorkers with a sort of, I don't know, backdrop of doom and gloom that if the federal government goes forward with the kinds of cuts that President Trump has now proposed and the House of Representatives has passed already in their budget resolution, if those come to pass, New York's budget situation for government will be a disaster. We could lose billions and billions and billions of dollars for healthcare, housing, employment, economic activity. The list is too long to go through, but food programs, enormous cuts to the SNAP program. So we could be in serious trouble later in the year, depending on what the US Senate does and doesn't do. But meanwhile, the state budget, we did continue our commitment to cutting middle-class taxes, expanding the child tax credit. We paid off unemployment insurance debt for businesses who had ended up with enormous debt due to the pandemic. We finally delivered statewide universal free school meals. We finally established the housing access voucher program for families at risk of becoming homeless. We secured increased funding for CUNY and SUNY, made critical investments in reproductive and maternal health care, including funding for abortion medication grants, new parent benefits, and progress on Medicaid coverage for infertility treatments. Doesn't mean I don't have a big list in front of me for the next 10 days, but I actually think when people look at the budget we passed, they're going to find things in it that they're very happy about.
And when it comes to funding cuts from the federal level that you mentioned earlier, how worried are you that the legislature might need to return to the Capitol later this year to address those cuts?
I'm really, really worried. I have been since President Trump was elected and said he was going to do this to us. I think now, throughout the country, people who don't even really follow government so carefully are also really, really worried. I mean, red states, members of Congress are going home and having town halls and literally being screamed off of the stage in their own districts where people did vote for Donald Trump. But they actually didn't think they were voting to cut their health care. They didn't think they were voting to cut SNAP benefits. They didn't think they were voting to reduce Social Security benefits. In fact, people are still running around saying, no, we'll never do that. But then apparently they didn't read the bill they voted for already. So I'm worried. And like most New Yorkers, I am pressuring the Republican control of both houses in Washington to make sure that this does not happen. Because it won't just be negative for New York, it'll be negative for all 50 states. And a decent amount of the research shows that the states that will be hit hardest are actually red states that voted in these people. You know, we in New York can say, well, we don't vote Republican very often, but we still live here. And so we're going to be stuck with just these cuts that New York can't possibly backfill from our own budget. It's going to be very painful.
And can you tell us about the governor's authority to make changes to the enacted budget if and when cuts come from Washington? How did this ultimately come together in the budget?
Well, the governor always has the ability to make cuts if necessary. The governor always has the authority to call us back into session, even if we're not in session, on the grounds that there are critical bills that she needs us to review and hopefully, from her perspective, pass. So we did make an arrangement in this budget that if we face a minimum of a $2 billion deficit brought on by reductions in federal money. That triggers a process for the legislature to come back with the governor and evaluate what changes we must make. So that's a bit new and it's a little technical in the budget, but it actually makes sense. If we're facing that big a hit from the federal government mid-year, and I suspect we could be facing much bigger hits, we should come back. We should discuss as two houses with the governor. Now, what do we do?
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Senator.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
And we were speaking with State Senator Liz Krueger, chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Now turning to another important topic. In recent years, lawmakers have been pushing to improve access to women's health products across the state. They say that the stigma around menstrual products needs to be addressed. Our Elise Klein dove into the efforts in the final days of the legislative session. Here's that story.
Thousands of bills go through Albany every legislative session, some of which in recent years have targeted the issue of period poverty. Period poverty is the lack of access to menstrual products. Lawmakers continue to push for progress to reduce the stigma and improve access to these medically necessary products for women and young girls. However, one of the biggest obstacles seems to lie in what happens after a bill is signed into law. The proper implementation of policies is the key to their success as laws. State Senator Roxanne Broussard, a Democrat representing parts of Brooklyn and a leading advocate for menstrual equity and access, says lawmakers need to continue conversations about policies around this issue.
We've asked for it to be in the prisons, in the schools, in the shelters, these various places. And, sometimes we hear that it's not there. And so we have to look at what is happening and what is causing the organizations not to have the products readily available.
By law, all public K-12 schools in the state are required to provide free tampons and pads to students at no cost to them. This is according to a 2016 New York City local law and a 2018 state law. WMHT found that schools in New York City and numerous cities across the state are not complying. According to a lawsuit by Period Law, the New York City Department of Education, overseeing the implementation of the local 2016 law, consistently failed to deliver on its legal obligation and falsified compliance data. Laura Strausfeld, the founder and executive director of Period Law, says for years they have heard reports from students not receiving the free period products required by this law. They have also coordinated with the New York City Council to acquire documentation on the implementation process.
It was still very unsatisfying, so we did file a lawsuit in March. And our hope is that the pressure will finally make the products not only available to students in the city schools, but make New York City's program the marquee program for the rest of the country.
A spokesperson from the department said in a statement sent to WMHT that they are committed to providing free menstrual products to students and following state and local laws. Students who were supposed to be helped by the legislation are now the ones suffering as the rollout struggles to work. When 18-year-old high school senior Elisa Nudar got her period unexpectedly during a math exam, she went to the bathroom hoping to find a pad, but the bathroom wasn't stocked.
So I had to keep asking people who came into the bathroom and asking them, oh, do you have any products with you? And there were like 10 people who said no. And then it was just like 10 minutes has passed by then.
Nudar then went outside and fortunately found her friend.
And she was like, oh my God, are you okay? I was like, yeah, I'm on my period. So she went back to the classroom to get a pad. And she was like, oh yeah, she made up an excuse that the principal was asking her for papers. And she stuck a period pad inside her pocket. So she was able to give me the products. And then that was the first moment I was like, hold up, why is there a policy that's been there, but the situation still arising for different students?
The existing process for implementing the policy in New York City schools requires school custodians to purchase via the school building's budget dispensers, period products, and ensure they remain stocked. New York City Council members have said this decision, left up to typically male janitors, is highly problematic. In other cities across the state, some state lawmakers say school officials like superintendents don't seem to grasp the significance and the medical necessity required by this law. State Senator Michelle Hinchy, a Democrat representing Dutchess County, says she is hearing reports that schools in her district are not complying with the state law passed nearly 10 years ago.
Which to me leads exactly to kind of the stigma conversation. And they're not, like some of our superintendents and some of our school districts are not recognizing how important this is.
Kingston City School District Superintendent Paul Padalino says he feels pretty certain the 11 schools he manages are complying with the law.
We ordered all of the dispensers that we need to, made sure we had supplies.
WMHT asked for proof of compliance via the first and most recent purchase orders for the products and dispensers. Superintendent Padalino sent recent orders from this year. He later told WMHT that the first purchase orders no longer exist due to a local retention and disposition schedule. Strausfeld stresses one of the biggest reasons for this issue continuing through poor policy implementation is ignorance.
There's just ignorance, profound ignorance on the part of people who do not menstruate about the medical necessity of these products and access to these products.
Strausfeld says more training for school staff, such as custodians and superintendents, could help combat this issue. Legislators are also trying to combat stigma around this issue. Prasad says even in the state capitol, there's still a level of discomfort in speaking about periods.
I asked some of my male colleagues, I'm like, why can't you speak on it? Why can't you speak on it? We all came from a person who had a menstrual cycle. We did, right? And so it should not take us, much for us to have these conversations.
However, conversations overall seem to be growing. State Senator Natalia Fernandez, a Democrat representing parts of the Bronx and Westchester, says despite remaining discomfort, she's happy to see that there are more conversations around the issue. For State Senator Rob Rawlson, a Republican representing parts of Orange County, learning about period poverty has been eye-opening.
I never heard that term before, but boy, that's a reality. We need to respond to those things.
Rawlson is one of the only Republican members to sign onto a menstrual equity policy. He recently decided to co-sponsor Senator Fernandez's bill to strengthen regulations around the type of toxic chemicals like mercury and lead hidden in period products under the guise of fragrance, colorants, dyes, and preservatives. Senator Fernandez says she's worked to move the conversation of this issue forward through this legislation.
I remember the first year that I passed the bill when I had it in the Senate, and part of my floor speech was like, these are very intimate products. They are on us. They are in us, and we have to be very aware of what chemicals we're having in or on us. And some of my colleagues shook a little bit, like, you said it goes in you. I was like, because it does, and we shouldn't be ashamed to speak of it like that. Let's be very literal what this is and what are the potential harms.
Senator Fernandez's bill is one among others aiming to fight for menstrual equity and access. And this year, her bill passed both houses and is currently awaiting the governor's review. State lawmakers are also pushing for a bill that would put free period products in all state-owned buildings. The legislation is on its second try in the legislature this year after not making it out of committee in the Senate. The bill was put on the floor calendar in the Assembly but didn't make it for an actual vote. However, this year the bill has made it on the calendar for a floor vote in the Senate. Hinchey says the policy could play a large role in combating period poverty.
It shouldn't be a question if you walk into a restroom, if you're going to have access to period products in the same way that you walk into a restroom and you expect there to be toilet paper.
Advocate Lacey Giroux with the Alliance for Period Supplies says putting period products in public buildings is huge for the menstrual equity movement, especially for individuals who have to miss work or school due to a lack of access to menstrual products.
This bill has the potential to really impact period poverty in the state of New York and be able to give people access to places that they may not normally be able to go because they don't have the period products that they need.
Hinchey says she is confident the legislation will pass and be signed into law. However, the Assembly version of the bill has yet to be introduced. If the bill does pass before the end of session, the question remains, will it face similar challenges the state faces now with its public school policy? Some menstrual equity advocates say enforcement plays a big role in the success of these kinds of policies. Many lawmakers agree. Senator Hinchey says lawmakers have started to have conversations about schools that are not complying with the 2018 state law.
I think we have to engage with SED and figure out a way for them to be engaging with all the schools. I don't know if it's people who are going to investigate, if it's having our school districts to report on what they've done or why there's been challenges.
WMHT reached out to the state education department, but they did not respond for comment on enforcement issues. Other advocates add funding is also important when it comes to implementing this kind of larger scale policy.
In states that there's been mandates for period products in schools, but there hasn't been
funding that's provided from the states, it's been a big challenge for the schools to actually find money in their budgets to be able to provide those products.
Schools aren't the only places facing challenges. In 2019, the legislature passed a bill to mandate free period products in all homeless shelters. Since that time, various shelters have said they keep up with the mandate primarily because of donations. Tracy Pitcher, the executive director of St. Paul Center, says state funding would go a long way.
Because that would allow us to cover the expense of other things that aren't covered.
Assemblymember Ed Raw, a Republican representing parts of Nassau County and a ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, says legislators should caution policies without funding attached.
Because sometimes one-size-fits-all bills don't always work, but I think I would be generally supportive.
Hinchy says the fiscal implications are unknown, but if passed, the legislation would be overseen by the state's Office of General Services, which would determine what the cost would be. Lawmakers have 1 week left to pass this bill in both houses before they are scheduled to end this legislative session. However, lawmakers seem determined to continue conversations about these policies and enforcement around existing laws in off-session time. Elise Klein, New York Now.
Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,